apply for academia, I didn't apply for professional positions at first. With my ex, we talked about putting that together. Anyway, we both.
You want me to go on the end? You guys want to be over here?
You
start.
And I was really into that idea of sport. And it didn't pan out because when they asked me whether I wanted to
I'm sorry. What's your name?
Should introduce myself. Steve, we moved you over this. Okay, it's the right thing to do.
And I was like, no, I don't know Spanish. So I applied to Latin America. And I ended up in Mexico. Where? None? But no, I think I was good.
Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and start here. It's always encouraging that there's more people in the audience than there are on the panel, so I guess that's one of the prices of progress when we show up this late in the program. Here's the. There we go. Seem to have sort of recurrent technical problems in this.
You can just speak without sharing. Okay. Offensively better.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is the third and final session in the conference about some of the journalism and media challenges in sport today, and one of our speakers somehow vaporized in between submitting his paper and the conference, and so our middle speaker listed here, who was supposed to be Mr. Aranci, is not here, but we have Doug DePeppe with us here today instead to talk about a different issue, which we'll get to in a minute. My name is Steve Maxwell. I'm the editor of the Outer Line website blog, which is a website that focuses on the economic and governance issues in the sport of professional cycling, and sort of follows issues in that sport from sort of a niche perspective. I'm also the owner of Pocket Outdoor Media, which owns several of the primary endurance sports magazines in the U.S. And so I'm involved with both sort of pro bono and for-profit businesses in the sports journalism area. Andy Brown, to my left, is the editor of the Sports Integrity Initiative. I think some of you have heard from Andy earlier this week. He also follows independently a wide variety of ethical and sporting issues, and he's going to speak about the issues of maintaining objectivity in the sports media. And then Doug, on the end, will speak. Doug just joined us here in the last 3 or 4 minutes, but he will be speaking about corruption and I guess I would say,
Ad fraud.
Ad fraud in sports, sporting competitions and sports media. So we'll run through our presentations and then hopefully have time for a little bit of discussion afterwards. So what I want to talk about is basically the challenges of trying to maintain an ongoing and profitable business in the environment of sports that we face today. And I'm going to talk about this specifically from the perspective of professional cycling, which is, as you know, one of the smaller sort of niche Olympic sports, and one that has faced a number of reputational and ethical challenges over the last several years. So the situation we basically have in this sport is, and specifically in the media area of pro cycling, is a very consolidating industry. Historically, we've had a number of different websites and magazines, different entities that followed this sport over the years historically. And as the industry has struggled with the shift to digital over the last decade or so, many of the businesses in this sport have either consolidated together or have gone out of business altogether. So we've seen a lot of consolidation in the business. We used to have dozens and dozens of magazines and weeklies, and newspapers, websites following the sport, and today it's down to a pretty small handful. There are evidence that many aspects of the sport itself are flat or declining, particularly the sort of the main legacy sport of road racing has been pretty flat in terms of participation the last decade or so. And then we also face all of the sort of transformative changes that have affected the overall media. You know, the death of sort of the traditional print media, the shift to digital, the loss of advertising revenues that has come along with that as advertisers have shifted to digital, and the capture of much of that market by the large tech companies. So a lot of the historical revenue that sporting magazines were able to capture in the past has been sort of irreversibly lost through this shift. The sort of focus on clickbait or short attention spans, it seems to characterize a lot of the audience these days. The rise of social media as a primary purveyor of news, and the way a lot of people get their news and form their opinions these days, and so on. So there's a lot of changes that have been going on in the broader industry that also impact all of these niche sports media markets. We've estimated that today's cycling media business probably consists of something around about 50 or so what I would call significant entities serving different sectors and different regions of the international sport. That includes still remaining several print magazines. My business is still producing a bi-monthly print magazine, although the frequency of that magazine has continued to go down over the years. A number of websites, the emerging popularity of podcasts, video producers, a lot of independent bloggers like Andy, and so on. And there are a number of sort of labor of love types of media entities in this sport too. People that are just simply interested or passionate about the sport that contribute quite a bit of significant content for their audiences as well. But it's probably something on the order of 50 or so significant parties. Most of these are nominally for-profit businesses, but probably not too many of them today are actually profitable. As I mentioned, many of these have had continuing sort of cutbacks to the volume of their business. They've changed their format. They've tried to make this shift from digital or from print to digital. Many of them have had to cut back on staff due to loss of advertising, and some of them have gone out of business altogether. And to date, at least, few of the media entities in this particular sport have been able to really develop successful paywalls. There are a few that have established sort of membership programs or club programs where people pay a little bit to receive slightly different content or more detailed content. But the large majority of purveyors in this particular little sport have really not been able to successfully instill a paywall model yet. As I mentioned, the advertisers have shifted towards digital, but a significant percentage of those revenues have been lost to the Googles and Facebooks of the world, and so are historically sort of gone. So we find a lot of these businesses in the position of having lost basically both of their historical revenue sources. The circulation fees for print magazines have basically gone away. We've seen our publication fall by a factor of we're about 20 or 25% of the level of subscriptions that we would have had 10 or 15 years ago. So the circulation fees have dropped significantly. And then on the other hand, the other major source of revenue, the advertising, has also slipped considerably during this shift from print to digital, because the tech companies have captured so much of that revenue. So that's why we have an industry that's sort of in a bind. Both of the historical sources of revenue are declining, and we haven't yet found new models for generating new sorts of revenues. Other factors involved, the advertisers have also increased the use of third-party public relations firm or set up their own internal public relations capabilities. That combined with social media capabilities has allowed a lot of the parties and advertisers that we would have originally dealt with to go directly to their customers and sort of no longer have a need for the traditional media channels to get their word out. So what has that caused? I mean, basically a lot of the cycling media entities have naturally had to become a little bit more differential to their advertisers, and in the process, you know, some would argue that that's hurt the quality of and the objectivity of the content. At the same time, and some of the folks in the session yesterday talked fairly extensively about this, the primary subjects that we have traditionally covered, i.e. the athletes and the teams and the races and events and so forth, have also internalized a lot of their own branding and messaging via social media to take their message directly to the public, and that's made access much more difficult for journalists. And so all of these considerations have kind of combined together to create a bit of a challenge for both the objectivity and the quality and quantity of the editorial content. What's basically happening can sometimes seem like sort of a downward spiral as the print revenue and advertising revenues decline. You know, we have to tighten our budgets. As that happens, editorial content may start to suffer. As the content suffers, in turn, fewer people may subscribe to the magazine, and you know, the circle goes on. And we've seen a number of cases in our industry of high-quality journalists basically leaving the industry or going to other businesses altogether. And so, hence the need for the finding of new economic models. In addition, in this sport, the sport itself is so small that it's hard to find the size of audience to pay for content that may be needed to support an economic entity. You know, if you're the New York Times and you have a potential audience out there of 50 million people, and you get 1 or 2% of that audience, that's enough of an economic base to run a business on. If you're in a small sport like cycling, and your total audience out there is 100,000 people or 500,000 people, and you get 1 or 2% of that audience, it may not be enough to support a viable economic entity. And finally, you know, the sport itself is subject to a number of existential kind of threats. We've been the poster boy for the doping problem for many years. The sport is almost 100% dependent upon sponsorship because it's played out on the road, and there's no way to gather a gate revenue or ticket revenue. So the sport itself has a number of challenges that are sort of endemic to the sport that help to kind of intensify these issues. So the bottom line is we have a number of entities in this sport which are really struggling to survive. So from the individual media platform entity, the question for survival really comes down, I think, to these 4 questions. Can we make our content unique and high quality enough that we become kind of necessary or sort of indispensable to a certain audience out there? And clearly, most of these entities can't do that. The question is that audience going to be large enough? Can we present a significant enough value proposition that the audience is willing to pay for it? And then, is there a large enough audience that's willing to pay for that to really sustain an ongoing business? And I think that's an open question today for many of the people in the cycling media business. So, trying to figure out how to survive in this industry, I think there's quite a number of things that people have looked at. Better sort of what we would say in the States, better blocking and tackling, or sort of focus on the fundamentals, the standard business strategies of sort of doing more with less, cross-training, trying to conduct new models for revenue generation with new types of distribution and channels like podcasting. There's a lot of kind of standard business practices that a lot of these entities could focus down on more that are standard to any kind of industry, not just the media industry. A lot of businesses need to, I think, conduct a more frank sort of self-analysis. Look in the mirror and say, what are you really good at, and maybe what are we not so good at. Small organizations that have very limited financial resources that are in a highly competitive industry need to really try to focus on doing what they do best. And many small entities, I think, particularly in the journalism field, tend to try to do everything or be all things to all people. And so I think a focus and a sort of a frank assessment and an attempt to match your strengths and weaknesses to the opportunities that present themselves in the marketplace is critical. The whole area of sort of sponsored content or paid content is a very controversial and sort of contentious one across the media, particularly in the sports media. The whole question of trying to walk that fine line between keeping your advertisers but also presenting objective reviews of your advertisers' materials. We have a lot of instances where for example, in our field, some of the major bike manufacturers or major advertisers, and one of the things that we have to do is do technical reviews of the bicycles that they produce. And so there's a lot of pressure there to on the one hand try to maintain your journalistic objectivity, but on the other hand not drive all of your advertisers away. And so anybody that's been in the media business, I'm sure, is very familiar with this pressure, but it's been quite intensified in our sector in the last few years. And one of the ways to try to do that is to increase the amount of so-called sponsored content where you're clear to your readers that this article has been essentially paid for by one of the parties that you're writing about, so that parties can judge whether or not they believe that particular piece of content is objective. One of the interesting rules that I've learned in my time in this business is what people have called the so-called 7% rule, and that is that in a lot of these digital journalism activities or websites, that a relatively small number of people are the ones that drive most of the views and readership on the site. And various experts, I guess, have come up with an estimate that number is somewhere typically between 2% and 12%. And there's this so-called 7% rule that a relatively small number of readers are the ones that are coming back to your website multiple times a day, reading all of your articles, and really are the ones that should drive the direction of the website. And so I think a lot of sports websites don't really understand who that sector is or who that audience is, and if you can better do that, you can probably drive your content in the direction that will attract the most interest, and hence your ability to sell advertising, etc. And from a strategic perspective, I think it's really critical to step back and ask yourself, what is our real mission? And there's some differences here. I think some parties would say that the most important thing is very good, objective journalistic content, and we provide that as our product. That's our business, and our audience is our readers. And we want to make sure that we provide good content to our readers, and everything else will follow. Other parties have a little bit different take on it, and they would say, or maybe not say, but in reality, their practice would be that our product is really our readers, the eyeballs that we can supply to an advertiser, and our customer is our advertisers. So there's a real difference there, I think, and everybody probably has, there's a spectrum there, and people find themselves at different points on that spectrum, but it's a critical focus to say, are we really, is our primary and most important job every day when we come to work creating that objective and good content, or is it to try to make sure that we maintain our advertisers? So in terms of where I see the future going, I think in this sector, we'll see this consolidation gradually continue in many industries. And I've worked in other industries most of my life, and in other consolidating industries. Typically, you see a party step up who will play the role of sort of strategic consolidator, or roll up a lot of the weaker players together, combine costs, squeeze out the weaker parties, and kind of roll up this excess of capacity into a smaller and more unified entity or company to reflect the market conditions that are out there. We haven't really seen that in this industry yet. There's been quite a bit of two small companies combining, or one company going out of business, and this thing, as I mentioned earlier, but we haven't really yet seen a well-financed and committed strategic consolidator enter the business. I think that we probably will see that when conditions get tough enough. And I think the future will probably increasingly belong to those that focus in on a little bit more on very specific niche industries. One quote that I saw recently that I think kind of sums up our situation said that success used to come from being broad-based with a geographic monopoly. So that brings to mind sort of the old local newspaper, for example, that pretty much covered everything, covered local events, national events, sports, weather, etc., but in a very narrow geographic community. Today, on the internet, though, success comes from being narrow while sort of having the ability to reach the entire world. So it's kind of a major flip in orientation, and I think the sort of transformative change here that we've seen that a lot of us are still struggling to try to figure out how to deal with this new environment. The good news, and I think this applies to any of these niche sports, is that there is still an audience out there. We have a very passionate audience in professional cycling, and a very active kind of community online. It's a very popular sport, but it's just not popular with a very large number of people. It's not like football or soccer or baseball, etc. But there is an audience out there, and it still wants to consume good content, and it's still eager to debate content. We just have to figure out how to serve it better. And I think the real point is that although the internet has changed a lot of things, and the way we gather and consume and produce news, it hasn't made good editorial content free. I think a lot of people have the assumption, well, I should be able to go on this website and read the content free, and all of us experience that. I pay the fee to read the New York Times, or I pay the fee to read the Guardian, or whatever, but a lot of times, for example, somebody will send me an article from the Sunday Times of London or the Wall Street Journal, and I haven't subscribed to those yet, and so I read down the first paragraph, and then it says, stop and subscribe, and we don't always all do that. So I think the point here is that some of the onus is on us, is on the audience as the readers, that this content is not free, and we're either going to have to pay for it eventually, or it's going to go away. And so just in conclusion, the media business, and those of you not involved in the sport probably may not be aware of this, but it was really the media business, and in particular the French and Italian newspapers 100 years ago that really invented the sport of pro cycling by creating some of these iconic races, the Tour de France and the Giro d'Italia, etc., as a way to try to sell their sports newspapers. And so they were really involved with kind of inventing and developing the sport in the past, and hopefully we'll be able to find a role and a way to survive as a media entity in the sport in the future. So that's my comments, and I'm going to turn it over now to Andy. Andy's been in the business for what? You've been at the Sports Integrity Unit Initiative for 15 years?
Well, no. I've been working with the Sports Integrity Initiative now for about 4 or 5 years, but I've been a journalist for about 15 years.
Okay. So, Andy's going to talk about how do you maintain quality and objective journalism in a sponsored website or a financially supported website, and the challenges and opportunities there. So, Andy Brown.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. And I should say as well, there's probably a lot I can learn from your presentation in terms of the way we look at our content and how to sort of monetize it a bit better. And I'll explain more about this in the presentation. But the Sports Integrity Initiative basically is a website that deals with issues that affect the integrity of sport. So that might be doping, that might be match fixing, it might be corruption, it could be equipment being sold to different companies. It really is bizarre the number of avenues it can take you down. It seems there's a room for corruption everywhere. So, hold on, is it the yeah, so the big reveal, I suppose, the Sports Integrity Initiative is owned by Mike Morgan. Yeah, he's the founder of Morgan Sports Law, and he's a lawyer that acts for athletes who have been subject to doping charges. He sponsors me a small amount to produce the internet site. And I suppose the Sports Integrity Initiative was initially supposed to be a sort of part-time thing, and I was going to sort of supplement my income from that with some freelance journalism. And I still do try and do that. However, the amount of we were born on the back of the Russian doping crisis. So we founded the Sports Integrity Initiative just before the Russian doping crisis, and so for obvious reasons it kind of took off. And it's kind of taken up all my time. Unfortunately, this hasn't left me with much time to do anything else. But all of this isn't a secret, I should say. I mean, I've always told anyone who's asked who owns the website, and the company's filed, the information there is filed with Company's House for anyone who wants to find it. And I suppose the idea for the website was born out of cooperation between Mike and myself on tackling doping in sport. A conference that was my idea when I was editor of World Sports Law Report. And the idea was to have an informative website, not coloured by vested interests, along with an annual conference. But I suppose, you know, is there a conflict of interest there? There is a conflict of interest there. I'm not going to deny that there's a conflict of interest there. Mike represents athletes, but I would argue it's a perceived conflict of interest rather than an actual conflict of interest. But I'll get onto a bit more about why that is later on. But the accusation is there. So, moving on. So, quality journalism, the sort of second part of this question, I can't really answer that. I can't be judging my own work. I mean, sort of Jens came up with this title for me, and it's an interesting one to explore. Do we do quality journalism? I try to produce good content to the best of my abilities, and this is some of the stuff we've done. And you can immediately see from this slide, there's one article there that has absolutely nothing to do with doping or anything at all. Doubt remains over Rangers 2011-12 UEFA licence. That one caused me a lot of bother, and it was it's a very difficult one to write because I don't know if you know about the rivalry between Celtic and Rangers and everything that goes on up there. In Scotland, I'm sure one of our audience members at least does. But it involved threats basically to me for writing it, and it had absolutely no benefit to Mike at all. So, are we objective? I don't know. I can't answer that really either. I try and sort of be independent in my work. I do my best, but only the reader can really judge whether what we do is good quality journalism. Only they can make that call, I think. But I am going to use this presentation to have a bit of a defensive rant, I'm afraid, because I think that what I'm going to say in the following needs saying, just not on Twitter. And I'll explain a little bit further. So this is kind of the picture that anti-doping organisations want athletes to see. That they're prepared to protect clean sport, to assist and inform athletes. They want happy athletes on the faces of brochures, wearing nice T-shirts, and this is true. It's true. They are there to do that. But there's another side to anti-doping agencies, and this is that they're funded to test, investigate, and prosecute athletes. That's what they're there to do. And Mike's role really is in getting athletes a fair trial. And it's a role really that I support. You know, if an athlete's guilty, obviously they should be sanctioned for doping. But there's so many cases that are ambiguous at best as to whether an athlete's guilty. And I'm just there to stand up for fairness to athletes and sanction. In other words, the budgets of these anti-doping agencies depend on catching athletes through the testing and investigation system. And if there are no results from this testing and investigation system, there's a danger, I suppose, that budgets will be cut. And this means that it's in an anti-doping agency's interest, quite often, to paint every doping positive as the successful ensnarement of a doping cheat. And we've had quite a lot of experience in making no friends of anti-doping agencies by pointing this out on a few occasions. Here are a few stories we've worked on that illustrate this, I suppose. The one at the top there involved a swimmer who was staying with his grandfather, with his brother in his grandfather's house for his grandfather's birthday, and they were using the same soap and towels. And because of that, his brother was using clostebol, and he tested positive and was banned. Now, are we catching a doping cheat there, I ask you, you know? The Paula Pliego positive, the Mexican laboratory was suspended over that because it was a false positive. It was actually a false positive, and she didn't go to the Olympics, missed out on that because of that. The other one was a mother who dropped her breast cancer medication into her daughter's food, and the athlete tested positive. You know, there's so many cases in doping where the athlete is really, in my opinion, unfairly sanctioned. There obviously are cases where athletes should be sanctioned, but the majority of them, I would argue, have been caught by quality investigative journalism rather than the testing system. So, I mean, a good example here is Alberto Salazar. He hasn't been convicted, despite what you might read, of doping Nike Oregon Project athletes, which is just not true. Just like British Cycling and Team Sky haven't been convicted of using the TUE system. Again, it's not true. Speculation is rightly rife that both things might have happened, and anti-doping organisations have spent a great deal of money attempting to prove that both things happened. But that doesn't mean that they actually did happen. As journalists, we have to rely on evidence. I was quite struck by Michael Ask saying earlier, you know, it doesn't matter whether I trust Yuri or not. The important thing is the evidence doesn't indicate that Yuri or Rusada has manipulated the LIMS laboratory data. It just doesn't do that. So my view is that quality journalism must stick to facts and not speculation. And in my experience, there's normally an explanation that doesn't involve intentional cheating for about 60 or 70% of adverse analytical findings or positive tests. And the testing system is massively expensive, and it doesn't really work. And as soon as governments wake up to this, the funding acts may fall for them. But this is basically what having a sponsored website opens you up to. On Twitter, I've discovered there are groups of people operating under pseudonyms, and they drive speculation, basically, that everyone is doping. They operate secret invite-only groups, and they routinely criticise anyone who disagrees with their narrative. And by the way, I am a doping apologist. I'm also Mike Morgan's lapdog. I'm even, excuse my language, fucking gullible, one Twitter user wrote, for telling the truth about anti-doping, rather than speculation and myth. Because Mike owns the site though, they've been fed information by another Twitter user that I'm paid by Mike to get athletes off doping charges. They ignore many articles that I've written, and they focus on others that support this narrative. I know they've been fed information because I interviewed somebody, I'm not going to say who, and the sidemans tweeted things that I told only them. When I confronted the person and said, "What are you doing?" they denied telling them any of this. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the Colleen Rooney Twitter spat, but you know, very similar sort of situation. Mike Morgan has no input at all over what goes on the site at all. He doesn't get involved. The idea behind the Sports Integrity Initiative is we unearth a lot of the issues and develops work for them by making these issues public, encouraging more athletes to come forward, etc., etc. I haven't spoken to Mike or seen him since last November, when I saw him by chance at the UEFA conference. And this is partly as a result of all of this. We now can't speak to each other. It's ridiculous. But so I'm not going to be putting these slides on Twitter because I don't want to add a confuse and fire with this already. But the one at the top there is basically a guy saying that I didn't, that Salazar, I'd written that Salazar didn't break any doping rules. If you look at the article I've written on the right, there's the 3 doping rules that we broke, okay? And this is how this stuff can creep into the mainstream media. The article on the right there is the Daily Mail, and the doorbell on the left is a Twitter sign-in account. And you can see there that the doorbell thing, which comes from the idea that Mo must be a cheat because he said he didn't hear the doorbell for a doping test. Mo Farah this is, so he must be a cheat. That has crept into the mainstream media because of this Twitter sign-in account. And this is the danger of all this stuff, it completely distorts the truth. And I don't expect Twitter to be a paragon of virtue or anything like that. It is what it is. It's a social media account. People are entitled to say all this stuff. And they're entitled to say I have a conflict of interest. They're entitled to all of those opinions. I'm not going to stop people from saying that. But I'm just saying this is the downside of a sponsored internet site. It opens you up to this sort of criticism. But the irony behind it all is on the right there is the International Centre for Sports Security's journal. Okay, and I was writing for them. However, it was pointed out to me that they may be involved in greenwashing, which we talked about earlier in previous sessions. And I went to New York and actually interviewed them and asked them about it and called them out on it. After Declan Hill at this conference warned me to be very careful about who I work for. The Sidemen's ignored the fact that I'd called out this story, but they picked it up when it was borrowed by The Guardian at the bottom there. The problem is with this was fairly lucrative for me, but I had to, because my integrity was under question, I actually had to cut off that revenue stream because there was a concern that the ICSS journal was working for the benefit of Qatar by greenwashing sport. So there we are. And the problem with these side news, as I've said, is their tweets are used, quoted and reported as a reliable source. And I know that they lie. They've told lies about articles I've written, and so now basically I've stopped engaging with any of these guys at all. And the key point to all of this is, because I'm not operating under a side name, I don't have the freedom to make stuff up like they do, and they do make stuff up. The trouble is, and the problem I have with it, is when it's picked up by people who should know better and reported as facts. It's just not right. I also know these people aren't who they say they are. I've spoken to Nick Harris, who in 2013, by the way, in July 2013, wrote the entire Russian doping situation in July 2013, and it was ignored by everyone. But it was all there in a double-page spread in the Mail on Sunday. Wilder ignored it, everyone ignored it. All the same facts, everything was laid out by Nick. He's also been criticised by them. He along with Martha Kellner broke the Russian story. And he's investigated some of the people within these closed groups who are using these pseudonyms, and they're not who they claim to be. So all I'm saying really, I suppose, in conclusion to all of this, is just bear in mind that a Twitter pseudonym allows a user to make unfounded allegations against somebody without legal recourse. It's why they do it. It's the modern day equivalent of the parliamentary privilege that allowed the UK Parliament to conclude that it believed that Team Sky and British Cycling were cheating. Now, parliamentary privilege protects you from being sued, and even with that protection, they could only say that they believed that Team Sky and British Sky were cheating. So, in conclusion to this, basically just beware of closed groups and alliances that don't seem to have any grounding outside of cyberspace. And the bottom picture there is from Fancy Bears and its connections to the Russian state, which the FBI came up with when it was investigating this alongside the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury. They found the IDs of all these guys and linked them directly to Fancy Bears. That was another internet account operating under a pseudonym, and we're still feeling the repercussions of some of that today. So, in conclusion, basically, This is a quote from Caroline Wozniacki. I do my best and that's all I can do. I mean, I can't make a judgment on whether I have a conflict of interest, etc. It's up to other people to do that. But I do object to the fact that when people you operate behind side news and people that should know better pick that stuff up and report it as fact, it's not right. I've had to cut my own nose off to spite my face by cutting off other journalistic opportunities for similar reasons. But I do take what Steve said basically about the difficulty in getting niche journalism to pay for itself. I'm very lucky in the way that I have a sponsor, and I need to find a way of monetising the site, and so I don't have this hanging over my head. So any suggestions on that are welcome. And I should also say that we welcome articles from all comers. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. Maybe you could just introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about your organization, and then we'll get your slides set up. And I apologize for the last minute nature of this, but
Thank you, Steve and Andy. Actually, listening to you both, there's a really nice segue, which this was not planned. My talk on different types of threats from the internet has been alluded to or mentioned by both of you. So Steve was talking about business risk to media, and I'll be talking about cyber risk from a medium. You know, we've talked about the internet. Annie's talked quite a bit about the internet, and what we're seeing is how the internet's been weaponized. And so I'll be doing a little bit of talk about that. In particular, I'll be focusing on the ad spend. Some of the conversation here was how does traditional journalism and media, how is it monetized in the internet era? And unfortunately, I'm going to be talking about another risk to it, which is many of you have seen blogs and online sites that draw ads as a monetization feature to underwrite the content. And I'll be talking about how that's at risk through ad fraud. So that's what I'm here to talk about, but I'll start out just giving a quick introduction of what we do, who we are. So Sports-ISAO. ISAO stands for Information Sharing and Analysis Organization. In the US, ISACs been around for about 15 years. That's center on the end as a C instead of an O. It's now part of information sharing, is now national policy. And Sports-ISAO is a program office of a nonprofit, the Cyber Resilience Institute. And we started setting up monitoring activities for different types of cyber or internet risks, different types of attacks. We started for the Rio Olympics, day one anonymous attack, so it was a target-rich environment, both social media and hacking. Of course, WADA was attacked. I know Andy talked about Alberto Salazar, talked about Fancy Bear. All of those names and incidents are very familiar to me, and some of the attacks that, for example, USADA was attacked, and some of the manipulation of information that was propagated by Fancy Bear resulted from first an attack and misuse of emails, contorting or misrepresenting emails, and then engaging in influence operations where in some of those cases it was Fancy Bear, aka Russian Federation or intelligence organizations, to present a whataboutism, because the Russians had been identified right from Sochi and were barred from multiple sports events, and so there was an initiative that had been tied to Fancy Bear to make a lot of hosting organizations and those who were responsible, the Canadians and the U.S., for some of the investigations to point the finger back at those organizations. So that monitoring of these major international events, protect the athletes, protect the event, and also the sponsors, is an activity that we've been involved with for these organizations and projecting now Tokyo 2020. So that's just very quickly, I'll go into a little bit more, but that's what we're about.
Doug, before you continue, could you please figure out that microphone situation, because it's quite distracting. It's 3 microphones and 3 people. It's, you know,
Is this one? Yeah, that was right.
it is
Let's
on.
move this one.
Yeah, just bring it closer and it will work.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
light's not on. Okay, got it. Thanks for that. Sorry about that. Thank you. So 20, as I mentioned, anonymous, pretty major attacks happened during the Rio Games. Pyeongchang just a couple of years ago, the Olympic destroyer attack. So these major sports events have been targeted. Many of them have been state actor attack, but we'll go through and get into the ad fraud aspect here in a moment. So MethBot, you know, I'm talking sort of some cyber jargon now. MethBot was coined 2016. Massive diversion of attempted legitimate ad spend into a fraudulent activity that, if you don't know how, we all know that Pepsi and Coca-Cola and some big companies, they have their major ad spends on commercials and other ways that's programmed. But there's also algorithms on the internet that look at eyes on. I mean, how much traffic does a site generate? And the algorithms direct the ad spend onto those sites. And so if you can manipulate those algorithms or what they're seeing, the representations, then you can siphon off that spend onto illegitimate sites. And this was discovered by a number of organizations as far back as 2016, and it's substantial dollars, as you can see. Just we were asked to limit this to 10 minutes, so we're not going to do a deep dive, but just to give you, this is one example of how the fraud happens. Oftentimes they generate whole fake websites, but they also, and then the publishers will say, well, we're monitoring our traffic and we don't have a lot of fraud on our site. But this is a tactics that's used where they basically steal a cookie and then put it on the fake site. And so the appearances are that, and they make the site look like, and I'll show you an example of this, the fake site looks like it's a legitimate site. And so the impressions end up being revealed on a false site, which is directing traffic, which is then drawing the algorithms onto them for diverting the funds. So during the Women's World Cup, and I'll go into this a little bit of detail, but we started monitoring, and the history, our experience had been monitoring different sites for telltale signs, and it had been generally state actors. And we were monitoring Fancy Bear, we were monitoring, there's a site in the Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen that monitors Russian bots called Hamilton 68, I think it's called. So a number of leads that we use to start to, and certainly setting up different open source tools to monitor Facebook, to monitor Twitter, to have certain things we're looking for, certain searches run. And what we found, and it had been up until the Women's World Cup, most of it had been this state actor type of an attack. What we started to find with, and we didn't know who the source was originally when we detected it, but we saw this Android scam. Prior to the Android scam, there was an alert that there was a streaming technology that had been exploited, that there was a vulnerability identified. And that's what we started picking up on, and so we were sending out alerts to be on the lookout for certain types of activity. And here's an example of it. So on the right, it looks like Sky, but it's not a legitimate site. So that was, it appeared to be related to Sky. It is actually a bogus or spoof site. On the bottom left was a Twitter feed. And so what the hackers were doing was using Twitter and luring them through Twitter to link to a site, to one of these fake sites that looked legitimate. And what they were, the lure was free streaming, right? So you're looking for a match, here's where you go. And you're leveraging the eyes that are on Twitter, directing traffic to a malware-laden site. Interestingly, once the game was on, the match was on, they were looking to monetize this, and so they didn't want to be detected. So after the match started or midway through it, all of the Twitter tweets would be deleted, right? And also the sites themselves were not active with malware. They would wait until the load was high and then activate the malware, so it wasn't constantly activated where it might be detected by different companies. And then once they were targeting both, well, the exploit was on streaming, a streaming technology, and then they were targeting Windows-based systems and Android systems. And our next step was to, let me just go through, here are the steps in the process. So they found an exploit for video streaming. They utilized that and deployed that on these fake sites. They advertised this, as I mentioned, they advertised it through Twitter and through Facebook, drew traffic on it. Once an Android device or a Windows device went to that site and it was activated, then their device would be compromised, which led us to start to look at, okay, well, what is their objective? Like, what's the monetization scheme? Ordinarily, you would expect that they would steal personal information off the device, right? That was not their attack. That was almost too simple. They then looped the compromised devices into a botnet. So they owned the device, and they looped that into a botnet for bandwidth. And then with that bandwidth, they engaged in click fraud, right? So the click fraud was driving traffic to the fraudulent sites that were diverting advertising dollars, and then they pocketed, the monies, right? So, sort of the bad news here. I think it's worth knowing, of course, but Steve was talking about some of the challenges, and here's a new challenge: is one way to monetize journalism, right, is through ads, and now we have to be concerned about this, as well as being part. And ultimately, the risk is, and we're pursuing some of this with major advertisers, but they start to lose their incentive to sponsor and advertise major sports because a large percentage of their expenditure is being siphoned off. So just some example of the amount of spend and some of the different studies showing how much fraud is occurring now through the internet, north of 50%. So if you're spending multi-millions of dollars on a major event, and half of that is being diverted into fraud, into criminal schemes, how do you manage that risk? And does it disincentivize? Of course it does, right? Unless it's managed. And projections are for 2020, Tokyo, the spend is going to be north of 1.2 billion. So it's a significant amount of advertising funds used on sport. Oops. And that's quick, down and dirty. Was asked to be quick about this, so we're, I think, all available now for any questions you might have.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Are there cases where media companies manipulate their own sites to try to hype the advertising? I mean, manipulate the viewership on their own sites? try to promote that to advertisers?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't have a study to give you. So I don't want to, I would believe with all that's happening now on the internet that that's most likely happening as well.
So does anybody have any questions for any of us?
I do. Steve,
Sure.
I remember back in the day waiting for, Hi, I remember back in the day, Steve, waiting for Velonews to come, print publication. That was like, we lived for that to be in the mailbox, and reading Winning, and anyway, really old school stuff. But really interested in your presentation. I'm wondering, like, have you considered a partnership with Strava? And that seems to be where the growth is, or a similar entity.
Yeah, no, all of those things are sort of, I think, under consideration, and the other thing that maybe this is a bit of wishful thinking, but there are anecdotal bits of evidence here and there that the print media business is in a steep decline, but it's not necessarily going to decline to nothing, and that there are models that may allow some of the legacy print publications to stay in business in sort of a different format. And I just cite things that I see here and there, but increasing. I saw a figure the other day that part of the sort of so-called Trump effect on the major national newspapers, that a majority or significant part, and I think in the case of the Washington Post, a majority of the new print subscriptions were actually being taken out by millennial generation people. So and I see that anecdotally in my own life sometimes, where like my kids, for example, subscribe to a print edition of the Washington Post, and so there's anecdotes like that, and then there are models that have been successfully employed by quite a few of the sports magazines to move to sort of I guess what we call the sort of the coffee table, book sort of model, where instead of having 20 issues of Velonews a year, or 20 issues of like Rock and Ice Climber magazine a year, you focus on having like 4 issues a year, and they're all, glossy, beautiful photographs, 200 pages long, and it's like a piece of, art that you don't want to throw away. You want to leave it out on your table and look at it over and over again. So I mean, there's a lot of different models, and it's hard to tell whether there will be a sort of a residual market for the print media even after all of the dinosaurs among us are all gone, or whether there's new models that will kind of take that place. But there does seem to be evidence that some of the traditional media will be able to survive. In terms of thinking about parties like Strava, I mean, yes, there's a lot of thought that in a sport like cycling there should be one place to go where you can get everything. You can get your race results and all the stuff that we used to call news that now we get on Twitter or whatever. I mean, for example, if you look at our website, like last Sunday when the Lombardia race, one of the major cycling races, was run on Saturday, we didn't even have anything about it on the website until maybe 6 o'clock that night. So we know that people don't come to websites to find out who won the race. That you might have waited in the old days for the Velonews to show up in the mailbox to figure out who won this or that race, but that's not the model anymore. And so there's a lot of thought about how do you combine a lot of these different services into one sort of site where you could go to get your news, get your interviews with people and teams and all that, and also share data like we do on Strava. So yeah, I think there's sort of, in this business today, there's sort of nothing that's out of bounds in terms of trying to think about how to combine and survive and produce what the audience wants. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Simon Lichen, and thank you to all 3 of you for very interesting presentations. They would deserve a much larger audience. But nonetheless, it really was, they really were very insightful.
I will be bold and I will go ahead and dare to ask two questions to two presenters. One is indeed for Steve, and it's along the lines of the previous question. If I remember correctly, you mentioned in your presentation that your target audience is about 400,000. But isn't it, so the first question is, well, isn't your potential target audience, really much larger given the popularity of Strava, of services, of products like Peloton, like SoulCycle, and so on? And so I wonder if, in a way, these products/services haven't caused a revival of cycling. So that's my first question. And the second question is for Andy. My degrees are in journalism, and so I think I know what you mean when you say that only the readers can judge whether your content is quality and so on. It's not on you to sing your own praises, obviously. But my question is, can they really judge? Can most people, can the average user, citizen person, can they really judge quality journalism nowadays, given the amount of clickbait, given the amount of fake news, incorrect news, irrelevant news that is circulated through social media?
Yeah, let me answer try to answer your first question, Simon. I kind of threw that number out. I don't mean that to be an actual number. I'm just trying to illustrate that our audience is core audience is pretty small. I think the most recent figures, TV viewership figures for the most important event in the sport, in the Tour de France in the summertime in the U.S., there's something like an audience of 250 or 300,000 people per day, which is pretty tiny. I mean, it was at a peak when Lance Armstrong was winning his series of tours. The figure was like 7 or 8 times higher than that, and so I don't think we really know what the figure is, but it's definitely kind of constrained. I guess what you say about Strava and potential of a bigger audience, I mean, there's a good deal of truth to that. The problem that the media has is that it has, in this sport, it has a reputation of sort of insiders talking to other insiders. We just acquired this business a couple of years ago, and I think that's been the biggest critique that we've heard of our editorial content. So we have a bunch of guys who are like former bike racers and who know all the current bike racers, and they're focused on a very narrow part of cycling as a whole. We don't address, like vast fields of people who are interested in recreational cycling or bike, touring and bike packing and, commuters and all that. There's a huge audience out there and we're focused in this very narrow little niche of sort of professional road racing. So I think that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out is, part of our problems are self-made. We're addressing such a narrow and focused audience that it's just not very big, and if we can figure out ways to deliver content of interest to that broader crowd that maybe not necessarily knows the name of every rider on every team, but is interested in cycling from other kind of health or lifestyle perspectives, we have a much bigger audience. So it's a point well taken.
In answer to your question, it's a very good question, and I think yes, I think is the short answer, because as a journalist, you sort of know if you're writing a good article, especially at events like this, when people come up and say that article you wrote was a really good one, and that makes you feel like you've done a good job on it. But it's an interesting question, and I think there is a big problem which we see now with kind of fake news and stuff like that, where people think that what they're reading is credible and true, and I think there's a certain amount of loss of discernment in what is quality journalism in some cases, and people read things without thinking what's behind them. You know what I mean? But I also need to say as well, I forgot to kind of include this in my presentation, so I'm going to say it now. One of the things about having a sponsored website, even though I'm sponsored I'm sponsored a small amount to produce the website. It's made me a little bit lazy in terms of doing what Steve does and really looking at the numbers and really looking at who the advertisers might be and really pushing that side of things. I should do more of that because I need to sort of get this millstone from around the neck and make the site viable, I suppose. I hope that answers your question. It's a bit of a roundabout thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Speak really loud.
My name's Charlie. I come from Scotland, so I could talk at some length about Rangers and Celtic. Not something that's going away very easily. First of all, can I congratulate you all because I happen still to subscribe personally to at least 3 newspapers every day, and I can read them digitally. So I've already read the Guardian and the Times from home today. Because I do feel we're becoming a poorer society for having a poorer media. And all I can do is to encourage you, really, because I think you've got to do, as you're saying, we've got to try and improve how we communicate. I'm very aware that in our country, most of the sporting media is about football, soccer, and results, not much else. What I would like to happen is that the sporting media got into some other issues, other sports, and something beyond the results. So in a way, I'm hoping that the niche media might pick up, and is already picking up on some of the wider aspects of sport. Now personally, I've now become more interested in what I call community sport. Basically sport for people, which is getting, I would say, almost zero coverage. You might occasionally get something. There's an opportunity, I think, and I'm seeing it starting to happen perhaps in Scotland with the local newspapers realizing the sport is a big part of people's lives, day-to-day lives. And they've started in Edinburgh, where I live. There's a big sporting section, it's got bigger. They've started to put more local sport in there because it's of interest to local people. So the second one was this investigative side, which I think Andy particularly has been talking about. I remember listening to Andrew Jennings coming to a lecture, and there were also students in the audience, and I know there were 1 or 2 here. He encouraged students to get into a bit of investigative blogging of their own. And I can see cooperations between people like yourselves who've got professional sites of bringing in some of those students to get in a little bit more understanding. Because I don't think there's enough, that's my real point, is we need to platform things an awful lot better. There's not enough discussion. I go to too many funerals these days and people talk about how did people live. Well, they tended to play music or they played sport. It means more than people are giving it credit for. So it's really not so much a question, but hoping that you can go forward and multiply as best you can.
Yeah. Thanks. I guess we're about out of time, so thanks, guys, and thanks for listening, folks.
Yeah. Thanks for that comment as well.
Subscribe to 75 newspapers around the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're our whole business is
Single-handedly saving on a quest for saving the case is noble.
to the site.
No.
Facebook and project, and other organizations.